Kabir, I'll start with you. You got out of Dubai just before the strikes began, so maybe you know more than a lot of us. But as someone who's been there, how do you think that the Arab world is reacting to this? And I know that the Iranians made it amply clear that if they are under attack, the entire region will be at war. But did they see it coming? Did they see it as bluster?
Thanks, Palki. I think I was unintentionally on one of the last flights out, but that also shows. I don't think there was much of an inclination that this is going to happen in the coming hours and coming days. But of course, there was a lot of talk about the military buildup that had been taking place for a couple of days. There was also a lot of talk about some of the bases that the US uses in the region being emptied out. So there was something in the air. There was some movement in the air. People were not sure sort of what is the end game going to be. Some did believe, yes, there was a strike going to be coming and it is imminent, while the others, of course, pushed back on that assertion. It's sort of what has happened in the past 4 or 5 days has punctured the idea of a panacea that some of the states had as far as security goes. Of course, we hear about the great economic gains some of the countries have made. You know, Dubai is a huge financial center, not just for the region, but for the world. But now I think it has to sort of rethink about how it portrays itself and how it functions around its security, and what kind of designs should it take forward once this comes to an end, or there is an off-ramp as far as the Gulf states are concerned, because there's been a lot of concentration on their economic story. And I think the economic story is now interwoven, always has been actually interwoven with security. But the security part was largely taken care of in back rooms and so on and so forth. And we are seeing this sort of war of attrition taking place right now. You know, whatever has been lobbed by Iran towards these countries is fairly cheap in nature. They're cheap drones, they're not very expensive, but the force utilized to push back is conventional weapons, which cost millions and millions of dollars. So it's unsustainable. They know that in the long run. But for the moment, at least, there is a lot of anxiety in most of these cities on what lies ahead.
Lina, we were talking just now about how the media says that this was supposed to be a quick operation and yet it's dragging on, and now it looks like it is going to go on for much longer. We've just heard the foreign minister of Israel speak, and it seems like they are in it for the long haul. Do you think that was always the plan, or is that a recalibration considering Iran's response?
This was always meant to be a long-term plan, not just to change the regime in Iran, but to change the regional order in the Middle East. And the plan was made as a result of Hamas's October 7, 2023 attack on Israel. That attack changed not just the risk calculation for Israel and the US, but the whole strategy regarding the Middle East, because Iran was then seen to be a risk that formed an existential threat to Israel and to world stability in general. And while before October 7, 2023, the US and Israel thought that this threat could be contained somehow, October 7 was that moment that, in my view, unleashed what I called in an article in Foreign Policy, the Middle East 1989. It is as monumental as that, the shift that we are witnessing. And when you think that the regional order in the Middle East had been dominated by Iran for the best part of several decades, almost half a century, it is not going to be straightforward, swift, and cheap to change something as entrenched as that. So any reports of this was meant to be a limited campaign that's now spiraling out of control, or this was meant to be only a swift 24-hour or 48-hour operation, are completely misguided. Israel's strategy militarily is to strike the opponent when the opponent is at its weakest. And Iran has been at its weakest for the last year or so. And so the time now is optimal for the US and Israel to carry on this big, ambitious plan. And because, as I said, it's so complicated and entrenched, it's not going to be resolved in a matter of days or weeks.
Ashok, do you want to?
Just to pick up on that question, and you could answer it or anybody else could. Maps in the Middle East have changed, or the West or West Asia have changed more than once in history. They changed after the First World War, remarkably. They changed after the Second World War, somewhat. You are suggesting that we could be in for another period of political cartography and map making. Okay, fair enough. Without going into the morality of that or the viability of that, let's just presume that is happening. Previous attempts at rechanging maps have required presence on the ground. Post-World War I, certainly, there were mandates, there were armies, there were... Post-World War II, there were people on the ground. Is map making even feasible? I'm not going into whether it's needed or justified, that's a separate matter. I'm talking about the methodology of political map making or remaking. Is it even feasible without boots on the ground?
If I may add to that, not just map making, even regime change. They tried it in Iraq and it did not really work out the way they'd envisaged it. Even Afghanistan, after 20 years, even with boots on the ground, the outcome was not what was expected or what they may have calculated. Do you want to, I'll come to you, but do you also, Leslie, want to weigh in on this? What is the American strategy?
I mean, first of all, what I would have liked to have heard with respect to Israel's position was what exactly are the conditions that the government of Israel believes would allow the people of Iran to rise up and change the regime. That's sort of that's the most important question, and it's the one that hasn't really been mapped out either by the United States president or by Israel. There is this idea that the people will make this transformative change, which we all know is simply not possible in any dimension in the current situation. But what does it take to get there? And the focus, which is very difficult to ascertain, but seems to be on taking out the missiles, on removing any possibility for a nuclear program, and now on sort of preventing some of the attacks that are coming towards across the region. But how you get from that to conditions in which a regime that is so entrenched could actually have the kind of opening that would lead to transformation. It seems like a very ambitious, aspirational, probably the right goal, but very far from understanding what the circumstances are. On the U.S. question, I think we all know that the stated U.S. objectives have changed. First of all, there was no attempt to make a case before the strikes. They weren't announced. There wasn't a conversation. And then since the strikes, we first heard quite radical language, and then a more sort of scaled back language about what the objectives were. That's obviously a moving feast. But I would argue that the reason that the president of the United States didn't try to make the case is because he knew that he wouldn't get the support, and because he's wise enough to understand that this wouldn't be quick. To Lena's point, this couldn't be quick. This couldn't be a Venezuela, given the context, given the regional location. And so I think he decided to go for the strategy of ask for forgiveness, not permission, and I think he's gone for the strategy of there is no love. There was no love for the leader of Iran, and there was no love for Iran of the United States. So even though there are many, many people who are very, very opposed to the way that the president has gone about it. They don't want to get the United States engaged in a war, certainly don't want to send any troops to the region. That doesn't mean that they like the leadership, that they like the situation, that they don't want to see fundamental change. And you can imagine a strategy, and I can imagine, here I'm trying to guesstimate, that the president, first of all, didn't know how long the United States would be involved, secondly, being pulled along a bit by the Israelis, but thirdly, probably thinks that he has what it takes to either push it through, the US staying engaged, or getting Americans on board, because as the context changes, as the situation changes, as, incrementally, getting the US more engaged, that Americans might get behind it because they wish to win. I think it's a really tall bet. I'm not sure that he will win. I suspect he won't, but I think that's probably the calculation.
Karim, what's your reading? Is there a plan for the day after? And is this sustainable? Because taking the point that Kabir made earlier, that you have these $20,000 projectiles, taking on $4 million missiles that the Americans are firing, and it's the economics of exhaustion.
So that, I think, gets to two very important things that I think the foreign minister said. So I was listening very carefully to what was said, and the two takeaways from his presentation. Number one, Israel will remove an existential threat, and that could coincide with regime change, either during the war or after the war, some variation of this. So that gets to the point I think Lina made. This is a completely unbounded military operation. And it's not just about how long it will take or how sustainable it is. The objective is maximalist. The war aims are completely unbounded. So that means an open-ended confrontation, whether in terms of time or whether in terms of means. Second thing the foreign minister said, a change in Iran will change the whole region. And that can open up possibilities for expanding the camp of peace with Israel and normalization, which could or could not include Saudi Arabia and so on. And that gets back to the history that I think Ashok was mentioning about the feasibility of remaking the region by force. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to instill a regime change in Lebanon that would remake the Middle East, expelling the PLO from Beirut, forcing a settlement on the Palestinian issue in the West Bank and Gaza, and therefore remake the regional landscape in the Middle East. The end result was Hezbollah. 2 decades of war between Israel and the PLO in the West Bank and in Gaza gave us Hamas, an entrenched Hamas regime, gradually increasing its influence over the Palestinian national movement, and ended up with Hamas entrenched in Gaza. In 2002, before the American invasion of Iraq, Prime Minister Netanyahu mentioned, and I quote, "An invasion of Iraq would resonate positively throughout the region. Trust me," end of quote. 2018, he forced President Trump to exit from the JCPOA, arguing that this would close the door to a nuclear-armed Iran. And so we all know how these things ended up. The Israeli approach of attempting to remake the region by force is not new. It's been tried before. Every single time it has been tried, leaves us with an outcome of a region that is more radical, that is more fragmented, that is more militarized. And I fear this time will not be different.
Right. I'll come to Benedict, but Lina quickly wants to make a point here.
Okay. Just very quickly to say that the thread that is invisible and very visible that links all your examples is that Iran was involved. Who created Hezbollah in Lebanon in 1982? Iran. Who supported Hamas? Iran. And later on, it's also Iran and Iran. Iran very heavily involved after the invasion of Iraq, with the militias. So if anything, these examples ultimately show that what we are witnessing now with this very maximalist plan by the United States and Israel is not irrational. In fact, it is looking back at the elephant in the room. That was Iran. That was linked to the repercussions that you talked about. And they are tackling the issue at the source.
Ashok?
The elephant in the room, you say, is Iran. Fair enough. I get that. The elephant in the room for India we're meeting is actually the future of the modernizing GCC states. The UAE, to some degree, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, they are part of our economic geography. They are a business region which we have deep supply chain linkages going both ways and a growing economic relationship. We are not alone. Kabir Taneja works in Dubai. Many of his colleagues, he told me before this session, from countries in Europe, elsewhere, have flown out of their homes, their workplace. Wars are sometimes justified post facto by the economic opportunities they create. We all use the term post-war boom for years and years for examples and examples. Where is the post-war boom here? Are we instead seeing the risk matrix in the GCC states as a business region which is so valuable to all of us coming into peril? Irrespective of what happens, irrespective of whether there's regime change or there isn't.
Kabir, do you want to take this?
Right. It does come into question. I'm not sure if long-term peril is the correct answer, because they will have to build resilient systems now. They already have a lot of resilience on their economic part, at least. I think the part that the resilience lacked perhaps would have been kinetic in how they were perceiving this would go, because they relied a lot on diplomacy on how to balance the situations, right? A lot of countries actually had working relationship with Iran. A lot of countries also normalized with Israel. So they were hoping at some level, I think, that if this does comes to this kind of situation, that they will be able to, till a certain extent, take a step back and allow for this dynamic to play out without being part of it. But of course, I'm presuming they also game that they would be drawn in, right? But I think they employed diplomacy first and the political outreach first to try and make sure that that does not take place, and that hasn't worked out. But in the long term, they'll have to obviously now do a lot of rethinking to build up trust again for what has happened, because as I said, the panacea is slightly sort of punctured. But in the long term, I think it will be sort of, there will be setbacks to bringing back that kind of ideation of safety and security. But in the long term, I think they will be managed to rebuild that. Yeah.
Benedict, thank you for your patience. I want to ask how Europe sees this, and I suspect that they're slightly relieved that Greenland is out of the headlines. But the way things are going, I know the UK has allowed the use of its bases, although Donald Trump is not happy and he says we're not dealing with Winston Churchill, speaking of Keir Starmer. And the US president has also made statements on Spain that if we want to use their facilities, we will. Who's going to stop us? So do you see Europe being drawn into this? And if European assets come under direct attack, do you think they'll be left with no choice but to join the fight?
Thank you. It's good to be on the stage a second time today. Some of us, due to the flight disruptions, get a lot more Raisina than they were expecting. You know, normally I would be a proud representative of Team Europe on this stage. Today, not so proud. I think when your question is, you know, is Europe going to do something in this conflict? I can tell you very clearly, no. There is no political will. There is no plan, and there are no capabilities. And let me talk you through this. There are many who say this is yet another case in point that in foreign policy, there is no Europe. Look at our response. On the Sunday, my own Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, flies to Washington and supports Donald Trump. On the Monday, Sanchez, as you rightly point out, says, no basis for you guys. On Tuesday, Keir Starmer says the opposite of what he said on Monday and Sunday, and so on and so on. There was no clear European answer to this conflict. And now that JCPOA is totally out of the window, we have no other acronym. We have no other plan. That was it. And even worse, we have no capabilities, because now that the US is busy with this new theater of war, Ukraine really is left to us. We will have to pick up the pieces. We will have to do a lot more. And there is absolutely no way that we have any capabilities whatsoever to support the operations in Iran, except maybe the occasional bases in Spain.
Leslie, I'll come to you. Just a second. I want to ask you one more question. Europe may not want to take a decision, but if the Strait of Hormuz remains shut and if oil supplies remain disrupted, where will you get energy from? Are you going back to Russia?
I certainly hope not. I run around the world saying, let's not replace one dependency with another. I don't think we are ready to go to anyone at this moment. There is a huge debate in Germany currently on the price of petrol, where exactly 50% of the price is domestic taxes. So our first instinct is to cut the taxes to zero rather than to look for alternative sources. If this war drags on, then we will have to reassess. But at the moment, and I think I remember Christopher Landau this morning saying quite flamboyantly, I thought, that if you need energy, you can always turn to the US. That's probably our answer.
Good luck with that, Leslie.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to...
We need it.
To come in just with a brief moment of in defense of Europe. I mean, to be fair to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the leaders across Europe, they weren't given much time to prepare a common response, right? The case was not made. The United States of America has depended on having European allies for a very long time, and he did not, the president did not care whether Europe would stand behind or with the United States. If he did, he would have taken the time to consult, to give Europe time to decide what it would or could or should do. And European leaders, certainly the one that I know best, the UK, are in a fundamentally different political position. The United States president really has a very, very free hand. Congress has not constrained him. The people are not constraining him. He is not up for election for several more years. The midterm elections will have very little, if any, impact on his ability to continue a war with Iran. So he's not in Keir Starmer's position, which is incredibly weak domestically, could lose his leadership at any point, and where supporting the United States president will obviously come at a price domestically in the short term. So I think it's not quite fair to say, why did Europe suddenly not have a joint plan, after the bombing starts?
Fair point, but,
May I?
not that I
the
wish
other
to
Europeans,
complication is that
but-
Europe also does not work on weekends, so they called an emergency meeting on Monday.
Just
Yeah,
one
we
more
don't
thing.
do- we
look,
don't do
since
work on weekends.
Since we do need to look forward, right? Because this is an extraordinarily consequential and high stakes moment. I hope that what happens now, right, is that there are very serious, regular, immediate, urgent, ongoing talks between the United States, Israel, America's allies and partners in the Gulf, and certainly across Europe. It is absolutely essential going forward if this is going to not result in more death, more tragedy, a war that goes on for far longer than it can, that it needs to. It isn't just an academic question. It really is very much a question about the here and the now.
Sorry, Leslie, that I always agree with you, but just for the sake of making this panel even more exciting than it already is, can I just point out that Europe is weak, and yes, Europe is uncoordinated, but we are not stupid. I mean, the time the second aircraft carrier moved nearby, we knew something was going on. So it's not that on Saturday morning, suddenly we were surprised. We had weeks leading up to this, and still we didn't have a plan. So to be perfectly honest, it's great that you are fair on us. We shouldn't be fair on ourselves because we really messed this up.
It's never too late to pull it together.
Yep. So we've discussed Europe. We don't know if the Gulf Arab states will join in. Ashok, what's your view on whether our part of the world may also get drawn in with the ship being torpedoed, and one more ship is in the same waters, and they're worried?
Well, in a time of conflict in international waters, stuff does happen, to be fair. Okay? But yes, it is a fact that that ship had left Indian shores after an international fleet review in India. And it is a fact that while in international waters, it was not too far from where India is. So it's a squeamish question. Having said that, the question I'd like to raise to the rest of the panel is that we've seen the war expanding. Cyprus is Europe, Sri Lanka is South Asia rather than West Asia. How great is the tolerance to see the war move to other geographies? How soon or how far do we need to get for people to start to respond differently? Because this is no longer some faraway war.
Yeah.
It's coming closer home for a lot of people. Any thoughts?
Shall I? Yeah, okay. It's a race at the moment because the US and Israel obviously have very good knowledge of the military capability of Iran. And what we have witnessed in the last few days is Iran using fewer and fewer missiles, a bit more drones, but even that is not an infinite supply. And crucially, the missile launchers are being targeted systematically, mainly by the US in Iran. And that means that even the remaining stockpile of missiles will not be useful for Iran if it doesn't have launchers to launch them through. And so, meanwhile, what Iran is doing is go after oil assets, is trying to basically raise the economic cost, and hitting some infrastructure in Arab countries so that these countries, in Iran's calculation, either go to the US and say this campaign needs to now end, which has not worked. They're not going to do that. Or end up being involved in the war themselves. And what you're describing is also another way for Iran to widen the scope of actors that are involved in the war in a fighting capacity. Because this regime in Iran is not a regime that will surrender in the face of the US and Israel. It's a regime that has, from day one, been chanting death to America, death to Israel. And so it's a regime that would rather die what it sees as a heroic death than surrender. And so this gives us the long-term appetite of Iran being presented on one side and the military capability of the US and Israel with their knowledge and calculations on the other side. And it's a race between these two things. As things stand, militarily, the US and Israel are winning. Actually, they are. It's not just Peter Hegseth saying it. It is real. But the Iranian appetite for inflicting damage is not damaged at all. And therefore, Iran will try its best to expand the extent of the damage, both geographically as well as economically. But as I said, it's a race. But this is a very critical week, because in around a week's time, the military capacity of Iran will be significantly weakened. So it is likely that it will not be able to inflict these kinds of very high costs as it is doing now. And as for the Gulf countries in particular, they are as much as possible projecting resilience because they don't want to show Iran that its strategy is working. And so after this week that as I said, is expected to get quite more brutal, the situation might start shifting.
Do you agree with this assessment? Do you think that Iran is losing firepower and may not be in a position to impose costs on the adversary?
No, I think that's objectively true. But to get to Ashok's question about the spillover effects, so yes, the dominant calculus now in the United States, and that gets back to the whole question of scaling down the objectives of the war, is to prevent Iran from projecting its power beyond its borders. I think that's a literal quote by the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State. So it reduces the question of spillover to capabilities. Eliminate the capabilities, Iran no longer has the ability to regionalize the conflict and spread the conflict to other regions. I think that is an oversimplified conception of spillover. So spillover can happen in one of three vectors. Number one, yes, capabilities. Number two, radicalism. And number three, geopolitical turmoil. So yes, you may get rid of the capabilities. That has to be done definitively, so Iran cannot rebuild its missile program, rebuild its nuclear program, and so on, rebuild its proxy network. But we're leaving out the real potential for radicalism as the result of this conflict. Bear in mind, we haven't talked about Gaza. Gaza did not go away. So this existential conflict that we now have with Iran comes at the back of a genocide that happened in the Gaza Strip. But then that leaves the third vector, which is geopolitical instability. So if you listen closely to the Israeli case for war against Iran, yes, I mean, it's easy to talk about regime change. But the nuance here is maybe goes even beyond regime change. It's about state collapse. And if you look at how now the new objective of fomenting a Kurdish insurrection in Iran, about the intensification of bombing of border crossings between Iran and its neighboring countries. And so let's pause a minute and think, what would be the consequences of some form of state collapse in Iran? What would be the consequences in terms of refugees? What would be the consequences in terms of the outbreak of numerous overlapping armed conflicts within Iran that can spill over into neighboring countries? What would be the consequences of the remnants of a regime in Iran, in Tehran, embittered, perhaps emboldened because of the survival, and certainly retaining significant capabilities? When you look at those vectors, the spillover effect becomes much more complex than simply reducing the capabilities of Iran.
And I want to add one more question. This is for you, Karim. There's a lot of talk about AI being used in this war. Today, a Chinese advisor raised concerns in Beijing, saying we're falling behind on this. And there were reports of Anthropic's Claude bot model being used to plan this attack. Do you think that this triggers a whole different arms race?
Short answer is yes. And I think this is one added reason to pay very close attention to not just this conflict, but the way the Middle East has become a testing ground for the militarization of new and emerging technologies. So missiles and anti-ballistic missile systems, these are old technologies, but they are interacting, I think, in very new ways. And we've seen the missile war on a very large scale between Israel and Iran, not just in this round of conflict, but in previous rounds of conflict. AI, so yes, we see these new advances in the weaponization of AI for mass surveillance, for targeted assassination, but also, going back to Gaza, for the way Israelis used AI in decision support systems, for their targeting systems that basically triggered the onset of mass death in Gaza. And then, of course, that leaves drone warfare. And here again, you see very interesting test cases in the use of drones in the context of these conflicts, not just for cross-border attacks, but to target critical infrastructure, to target residential areas, and to shake the confidence that is the business model of the Gulf, as you mentioned. So this is a terra nova when it comes to the employment of these technologies. And the Middle East is unfortunately ground zero for this.
Benedict, your thoughts on this, on how, while countries continue to acquire traditional weapons and arsenal, we've seen drones being used very effectively in the other two conflicts, especially in Ukraine. And here too, Iran is imposing costs, at least now, and going after energy infrastructure in the region. How do you think countries should then prepare for what is clearly a hybrid and asymmetrical conflict?
You know, I think accepting that we will probably always be wrong on the nature of the next war is a good start. There's this saying that we always prepare for the last war and then end up fighting the next war. To me, it seems as if for decades we've been preparing for the war after next. And here too, I mean, remember how many people said aircraft carriers are just not a thing anymore? How many people said that long-range strategic bombers are not a thing anymore? And I just, want to draw the attention to the fact that the Americans are so effective currently because they're using submarines to sink ships, because they're using aircraft carriers to fly manned aircraft from. Yes, there are drones all over the place, and certainly more than there would have been a couple of years ago. But this is still a war that looks more like the war in Iraq than the war of the future. And I think we make a mistake at always focusing on these sexy new technologies and missing the point that legacy systems usually stick around a lot longer than we think.
Ashok, do you want to weigh in?
My final question, since we've discussed war, wars, well, we never done with war, but wars have a way of solidifying national identity. So it was famously said that the Ukraine war did more for Ukrainian nationalism than anything in previous history. In a sense, if you look at, again, the GCC states, they have responded to the attack from Iran as an existential threat to their way of life, to their very hard-earned economic prosperity and modernization. They've responded not in ideological terms, not in pan-religious or pan-regional terms, but as nation states. In a sense, are we seeing the solidifying of national identities in the Arab Gulf region? And what could that mean for the future?
Leslie?
I guess I would say I'm going to defer that one to Lena because she's deeply expert on the Gulf. But I guess I would add where we're not seeing the solidification of national identity in response to the current wars within the United States, which is deeply polarized. And I think we are unlikely to see it within Iran. I think we are seeing it within Israel. So, and the main participants that this sort of hypothesis doesn't really follow through. But I did want to pick up on one thing that you said. And it was a suggestion that Trump, at some level, is willing to stop at containment if he sort of rids Iran of its destructive abilities beyond its borders. And I just don't think that there's any evidence for that. I think the president himself isn't sure. I think that he was deeply upset by the protests and the killings of thousands of Iranians by their own government. I think he's willing to tolerate and even appreciate strong leaders, strong autocratic leaders, so long as he can talk with them directly. And that is not the case here. This is not, whoever emerges, if they emerge from within the given power structure, is not going to be somebody that's going to become friends with President Trump. So I think actually Trump's probably undecided, continuing to assess as he does. He listens, he updates, but much more inclined towards a more maximalist outcome, whether it's in this moment or in a subsequent moment. But even the idea that there can ever be containment that's just sort of a waiting station seems extremely unrealistic. And maybe there's a moment where this pauses. Is so long as this regime remains in place, it's a pause. And I think that is certainly the case now.
Lena?
Yeah. one thing that Iran was counting on is disagreements among Arab countries in the Gulf, especially that recently, for example, there were disagreements between Saudi Arabia and the UAE regarding Sudan and Yemen. So Iran's assumption was that these disagreements would mean the Gulf would not be aligned and coherent in its response. And what we're seeing right now is completely the opposite. So in terms of identity, if anything, this conflict is really, really strengthening a sense of belonging in the Gulf, not just at the national level, but also at the regional level. And as you said, in Iran, one of the calculations of the regime that also has not worked is that there's going to be a rally around the flag reaction if the regime is attacked from outside, and that has not happened at all. In fact, most Iranians want to see this regime go. And so we are also moving into an order in which the preferred model of governance in the region, and I say preferred by the US and Saudi Arabia in particular, is one of centralized states. And we're seeing this play out in Syria, we're seeing this play out in Yemen, and I expect it will be the same vision for Iran later on. Now, as for whether there could be people from within the existing system who could engage with Trump, I give you Syria as a vivid example of something that many people thought impossible. Who would have imagined that someone who was an Al-Qaeda figure would not just become the president of Syria, but have such a close relationship with Trump? And of course, he would not have become president had the US and Saudi Arabia not given the green light for that. So prepare to be surprised, I would say, when it comes to who governs Iran next.
Interesting. Kabir, if you want to respond to that, yes. And I also want you to touch upon the energy question because it's relevant for India too. I know statements have been made about how much we have and we have enough for 50 days and 70 days and so on and so forth. But at some point, we'll have to look at our options.
Right. So very quickly, something just to pick up what Ashok was saying. There's definitely sort of a movement of rallying around the flag individually in countries. So you can see that in online messaging specifically, the way sort of people are moving around social media. There is sort of this thing that this is our home, we have to protect it. So that messaging is definitely there. But I do find that messaging is very individualistic to states. If you see GCC as a bloc, as Ashok was mentioning, it's not moved intra-states or between countries, despite GCC being seen as a bloc. I think they have shared messages of concern with each other. They've called up each other, as Lina was saying. There were issues between Saudi and UAE, but they had a conversation because of what is happening right now. But no one has really yet mobilized in a cohesive, joint manner as far as protection or building a protection system is concerned on what's happening right now. So there are those blocks and gaps as well as far as a response from the GCC is concerned. And very quickly on the energy thing, I think, look, 50 days, 70 days, that's, those are technicalities. But we have to see from an Indian point of view, considering we import most of our energy, and energy security is critical to us. Something like Strait of Hormuz needs to be navigable. Whether that's 70 days, 100 days, 500 days, it just needs to be navigable for that kind of energy to come to our shores. We've experienced this before. There was a time pre-JCPOA when we did bring down our imports from Iran to zero, and we did have a lot of concern. And we did have to really hedge our bets to make sure that energy supplies continued. We did take a risk. We did burn our hand a little bit. And now, with what's happening right now, we need to be careful that we're not repeating the same mistakes that were made at that point of time.
Benedict, on the question of GCC countries mounting a joint response, do you think that they are militarily there to be able to do that? Also because they've always seen the US as the security guarantor of the region. And there were reports recently that they asked for some replenishments and those calls went unanswered. So are they in a position really to mount a compelling or effective response?
I don't think they are, but it doesn't matter. I mean, the point is, the only actor in this entire conflict that is acting even less strategically than us Europeans is the Iranians. By attacking their neighbors, by doing a lot of things you would you would imagine is, you know, an undercover CIA operation, because it's the one way to get the entire region up in arms against Iran. I think they have really nailed the coffin in a way. And so I think just by saying that they are ready to engage, by saying that they've understood they can no longer have it both ways, that they will have to take a stand on Iran one way or the other, and in this case, one clear way. I think the tables have turned. And when the minister made the point that you, Karim, have also mentioned, that regime change means region change, I think this is what he meant.
Right. I think that's an interesting point to wrap on, unless one of you wants to make a closing remark. The audience has been very, very kind. It's late, I know, but thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. And this is still, as we say in the news, a developing story. So we can have this conversation going. But thank you very much for your thoughts and for your inputs.